March 1951, somewhere in the frozen mountains of Korea. A young forward observer named Lieutenant Thomas Burke crouches in a bunker carved into hillside rock, watching Chinese forces mass for another assault. He has radio contact with 6 howitzer batteries positioned 3 miles behind the lines. He has unlimited ammunition. He has clear sight lines to the enemy. And he's completely useless. Burke calls fire missions with textbook precision, giving coordinates, adjusting for wind, accounting for terrain. The howitzers respond immediately, their 105mm shells screaming overhead to impact exactly where Burke directed them. The problem is that where Burke directed them is where the Chinese troops were 30 seconds ago, not where they are now. By the time shells arrive, the enemy has moved. Burke watches explosions blossom across empty ground, while Chinese infantry continues advancing untouched, flowing around the impact zones like water around stones. This isn't Burke's failure. This same scene is playing out across every contested hilltop in Korea. American artillery, the finest in the world, equipped with weapons that can drop shells into a bucket at 5 miles distance, is missing mobile targets with such consistency that Chinese commanders have stopped fearing American guns. They've learned that if you keep moving, American artillery becomes nothing more than expensive landscaping. The U.S. Army conducts emergency analysis in April 1951, reviewing hundreds of fire missions against moving targets. The results are catastrophic. Artillery batteries are achieving effective target destruction in less than 12% of missions against troops in motion. 12%. That means 88 shells out of every 100 are accomplishing nothing except digging holes and wasting ammunition. The mathematics are brutal. A typical fire mission might take 45 seconds from the moment Burke calls coordinates until shells impact. The standard Chinese infantry advance during assault operations moves at approximately 200 yards per minute during the final push. That's 150 feet in 45 seconds. Burke aims at what he sees. By the time shells arrive, the enemy formation has moved beyond the kill radius. The human cost is staggering. American infantry defending hilltop positions can't rely on artillery support against mobile attacks. When Chinese forces launch their characteristic human wave assaults, thousands of soldiers advancing in coordinated rushes, American defenders face them with rifles and machine guns alone. Artillery that should be shredding enemy formations before they reach defensive lines is instead creating expensive firework displays that kill nothing but grass. The generals know something has to change. The artillery officers know something has to change. But nobody knows what that something is, because the problem isn't equipment or training. American gunners are among the best in the world. They can hit stationary targets with incredible precision. The problem is that war doesn't consist of stationary targets anymore. The solution, when it finally emerges, will come from an unexpected source. A World War I veteran who understood ballistics, a British mathematician who studied cricket, and a forward observer who starts measuring things nobody thought to measure. This is the story of how American artillery learned to shoot where the enemy was going instead of where the enemy was, and why it took thousands of casualties before anyone figured out the problem wasn't aiming, it was timing. Lieutenant Thomas Burke grew up in Montana, where hunting elk in mountain terrain required understanding how animals moved through landscape. His father taught him to lead moving targets while hunting, to aim ahead of the deer, to account for the second or two of bullet flight time. But deer moved at 20 miles per hour. Chinese infantry assaults moved at nearly twice that speed, and the bullets Burke was firing weighed 95 pounds and took nearly a minute from request to impact. Burke had graduated from West Point in 1949, trained in artillery tactics that emphasized precision targeting. The doctrine was clear: observe the enemy, calculate coordinates, call for fire. Adjust based on observation of impact, repeat until target is destroyed. The system worked beautifully against bunkers, buildings, supply depots, anything that stayed still. It failed completely against anything that moved. The Chinese understood this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. Their assault doctrine emphasized rapid movement during attacks, with infantry formations moving in short rushes rather than steady advances. They'd observed American artillery response patterns and calculated that if they moved immediately after artillery impacts, they could stay ahead of the next fire mission. American gunners would drop shells on where the Chinese had been, never where they currently were. Burke first recognized the pattern during an engagement on Hill 717 in early March. Chinese forces launched a night assault against his observation post. Burke called fire mission after fire mission, each one delivered with textbook accuracy to the coordinates he provided. Each impact arrived seconds too late, catching empty ground while the enemy flowed past. The Chinese reached American defensive positions and engaged in brutal close combat that artillery should have prevented. After the battle, Burke walked the impact zones. The shell craters were exactly where he'd called them. His coordinates had been perfect. His adjustments had been correct. But every single crater sat in space the enemy had already vacated. The artillery had hit nothing but dirt. Burke started keeping a notebook. Not standard after-action reports, but detailed observations about enemy movement patterns. He timed how long Chinese formations took to cover specific distances. He measured the delay between his fire requests and shell impacts. He calculated the gap between where he aimed and where the enemy actually was when shells arrived. The numbers were damning. Average time from fire mission request to first shell impact, 42 seconds. Average distance covered by advancing Chinese infantry in 42 seconds, 140 feet. Standard 105 mm howitzer kill radius against personnel, 100 feet. The math was simple. By the time shells arrived, the target was already outside the effective destruction zone. Burke presented his findings to Captain Raymond Mitchell, the artillery liaison officer, in mid-March. Mitchell listened while studying Burke's notebook, filled with measurements and calculations. "Lieutenant, every forward observer in this sector is reporting the same problem. We can't hit mobile targets. Has anyone figured out why, sir? The prevailing theory is that our gunners need better training." Burke shook his head. "Sir, the gunners are hitting exactly what we tell them to hit. The problem isn't execution. The problem is that we're telling them to hit the wrong place." Mitchell set down the notebook. "Explain." "We're calling fire missions based on where the enemy currently is. But by the time shells arrive, current position has become past position. We need to call fire missions based on where the enemy will be. That's called leading the target, Lieutenant. We know about that principle. With respect, sir, we know about it theoretically. But I haven't seen a single training document that tells forward observers how to calculate proper lead for moving formations. We're taught to report current enemy positions accurately. We're not taught to predict future enemy positions." Mitchell was silent for a moment. "You're talking about firing at empty ground and hoping the enemy walks into it. I'm talking about firing at where the enemy is going to be when shells arrive instead of where the enemy was when we saw them. Do you understand how difficult that is? You're asking observers to calculate enemy movement speed, direction, acceleration, time of flight for the shells, and combine all that into adjusted coordinates while being shot at. I understand it's difficult, sir, but continuing to aim at current positions means continuing to miss." Mitchell picked up Burke's notebook again. "How would you implement this?" "Start by measuring enemy movement patterns systematically. Chinese assault formations move at predictable speeds. Once we know typical rates of advance, we can create standard lead distances for different scenarios. If the enemy is advancing at infantry assault speed, add 150 feet to the coordinates in their direction of travel. If they're withdrawing at retreat speed, calculate accordingly. You're proposing a targeting system based on assumptions about enemy behavior. I'm proposing a targeting system based on observed enemy behavior, sir. The Chinese infantry has been using the same assault patterns for months. They're predictable because their tactics work. We just need to account for that predictability." Mitchell closed the notebook. I'll forward this to battalion, but don't expect quick approval. Changing artillery doctrine requires evidence that the new method works better than current practice. Then we need to test it, sir. Unauthorized testing of artillery tactics isn't exactly procedure, Lieutenant. Neither is losing hilltops to enemy assaults that artillery should have stopped. Mitchell studied Burke for a long moment. If you were to conduct completely unauthorized field testing of predictive fire missions during actual combat operations, I couldn't officially know about it. Burke understood. Don't ask permission. Just prove it works. Over the next 2 weeks, Burke conducted careful observation of every Chinese assault in his sector. He timed their advances. He measured distances covered. He documented patterns in their movement. Chinese forces, he discovered, were extraordinarily consistent. When launching final assault pushes against hilltop positions, they advanced at almost exactly 200 yards per minute. When conducting tactical withdrawals, they moved at roughly 300 yards per minute. When repositioning between assaults, their speed dropped to about 100 yards per minute. The consistency made sense from a tactical standpoint. They were moving at the maximum speed that allowed them to maintain formation, cohesion, and control. Faster movement would scatter their forces. Slower movement would expose them to defensive fire for longer periods. They'd optimized their tactics through experience, and that optimization created predictability. Burke also measured artillery response times meticulously, from the moment he pressed his radio transmit button to the moment of first shell. Impact averaged 42 seconds with his regular battery. Different batteries had different response times depending on their preparation level and distance, but most fell between 38 and 48 seconds. With this data, Burke could calculate required lead distances. If Chinese infantry was advancing at 200 yards per minute, and artillery response time was 42 seconds, shells needed to impact approximately 140 feet ahead of current enemy positions. Burke started converting this into adjustment terminology that gunners would understand. Enemy formation, advancing. Add 70 yards to coordinates, direction of advance north. The first test came during a Chinese probe against Svio 617 on March 28th. Burke spotted enemy forces massing in a valley, clearly preparing for an assault. Instead of calling coordinates on their current position, he calculated where they would be when shells arrived. Added the appropriate lead distance and called the mission Fire Mission, Grid Coordinates, ... double quotes. Burke gave numbers that placed the impact zone 150 feet north of where Chinese forces currently stood, directly in their projected path of advance. The gunners responded with obvious confusion. Confirm coordinates. We're not seeing targets at that location. Coordinates confirmed. Target will be at that location at time of impact. Fire for effect. There was a pause. Then, rounds out. Burke watched Chinese forces begin their advance exactly as he'd predicted. They moved north at their standard assault speed. 40 seconds later, 105mm shells began impacting. Not behind the Chinese formation where previous missions had landed, but directly in their path. The advancing troops ran straight into the explosions. The effect was devastating. The Chinese assault staggered, broke, reformed, tried to continue. Burke called immediate adjustment. Add 75 yards, same direction. The enemy formation had kept moving through the first barrage. His second mission needed to account for their continued advance. Shells impacted again, this time catching the reformed Chinese units. The assault collapsed completely. Enemy forces retreated in disorder, leaving casualties scattered across the hillside. Burke's radio crackled. Good shooting, observer. How'd you know they'd be there? They're predictable battery. They always move at the same speed. Over the next week, Burke refined his technique through repeated engagements. He learned to read Chinese formation indicators that predicted assault speed. Tight formations meant slower, more controlled advances. Dispersed formations meant faster movement. He developed a mental table of lead distances for different scenarios. Infantry assault, add 150 feet. Rapid advance, add 200 feet. Tactical withdrawal, add 250 feet. His kill rates climbed dramatically. Missions that previously missed 88% of the time were now hitting 70% of the time. The improvement was so obvious that other forward observers started asking questions. Lieutenant David Chen, positioned on Hill 810, watched one of Burke's fire missions destroy a Chinese assault that had been threatening Chen's position. He radioed Burke afterward. "How are you hitting them?" "Every mission I call lands behind the enemy. I'm not shooting where they are," Burke explained. "I'm shooting where they're going to be." How do you calculate that? Time their movement. Measure your artillery response time. Add lead distance based on enemy speed and direction. It's like hunting, except the deer are trying to kill you and you're shooting with a cannon instead of a rifle. Chen tried the technique during the next Chinese probe against his position. His first attempt missed, landing too far forward. He'd overestimated enemy speed. His second attempt, with adjusted lead calculation, caught the enemy formation perfectly. Chen became an immediate convert. By mid-April, 5 forward observers in the sector were using predictive fire missions. Their collective success rate was forcing Chinese commanders to adapt. Enemy assault patterns started becoming less predictable, with forces moving in irregular spurts rather than steady advances. But even irregular movement was better than the previous confidence Chinese troops had shown while advancing under ineffective artillery fire. The unofficial success drew official attention. Colonel Marcus Webb, commanding the artillery group, noticed that fire missions from Burke's sector were achieving hit rates 3 times higher than other sectors. He visited Burke's observation post in late April. "Lieutenant, your statistics are extraordinary. Either you're the luckiest forward observer in Korea or you're doing something different. Which is it?" Burke handed Webb his notebook, now filled with measurements, calculations, and observations. "I'm doing something different, sir." Webb read for several minutes. "You're firing at predicted future positions instead of observed current positions." "Yes, sir. This isn't taught in any artillery manual I've seen." "No, sir." But it works. Why didn't you request permission to test this technique?" "Because requesting permission takes time, sir. Men were dying while we waited for approval to try something that made sense." Webb closed the notebook. "You violated doctrine." "I adapted doctrine to tactical reality, sir. That's not your authority as a lieutenant." "With respect, sir, it became my authority when I watched Chinese forces walk through artillery barrages that should have killed them." Someone needed to fix the problem. Webb stared at Burke for a long moment. The colonel had been an artillery officer for 23 years. He'd fought in World War II, where artillery had been devastatingly effective against German positions. But German positions had been static. Korea was different. The enemy moved. "Lieutenant, I'm ordering you to conduct a formal demonstration of your technique for all forward observers in this division. You'll have 2 days to prepare a training program, sir. I'm not qualified to train. You're the only person in this division who's figured out how to hit moving targets consistently. That makes you the most qualified person we have." The training session took place on April 27th in a bunker complex behind the lines. 23 forward observers attended, ranging from fresh lieutenants to experienced captains. Burke stood in front of a blackboard, feeling completely out of his depth. "The problem we're facing is timing," Burke began. "We're trained to report enemy positions accurately. But by the time our reports become artillery impacts, those positions are historical data. The enemy has moved." He drew a simple diagram on the blackboard. Chinese assault formations move at approximately 200 yards per minute. Our artillery response time averages 42 seconds. That means the enemy covers 140 feet between observation and impact. One of the captains raised his hand. "We know about leading targets, Lieutenant. But how do we calculate lead when the enemy is moving at variable speeds across uneven terrain?" "We don't calculate it precisely," Burke admitted. "We estimate based on observed patterns. Chinese forces are consistent in their movement speeds because consistency helps them maintain control. If you observe an infantry formation preparing for assault, you can predict they'll advance at approximately 200 yards per minute. Adjust your coordinates forward by 150 feet in their direction of travel. What if they don't move exactly as predicted? Then you miss and you adjust for the next fire mission. But even imperfect prediction is better than shooting at where they were. I've been using this method for a month. My hit rate is around 70%. What's everyone else's hit rate against mobile targets? The room was silent. Everyone knew the answer. 12%. Burke spent 3 hours teaching his methodology. He showed them how to time enemy movements. He explained how to calculate artillery response times for different batteries. He provided standard lead distances for common scenarios. Most importantly, he taught them to think differently about targeting. Stop trying to hit what you see, Burke emphasized. Start trying to hit where your target will be when shells arrive. You're not taking a photograph of enemy positions. You're predicting a future event. The technique spread rapidly through forward observer networks. By May, over 60 observers were using predictive fire missions. The collective impact on Chinese assault effectiveness was measurable. Enemy casualty rates during assaults increased dramatically. Chinese commanders started reporting to their superiors that American artillery had suddenly become far more dangerous. But the technique had limitations that became apparent as Chinese forces adapted their tactics. Enemy formations started moving in less predictable patterns, advancing in short rushes with random pauses, changing direction unexpectedly. Predictive fire missions that relied on consistent enemy movement became less effective against this adapted behavior. Burke recognized the problem during an engagement in late May. He'd called a predictive fire mission against a Chinese formation that appeared to be advancing for assault. Instead of maintaining steady movement, the enemy stopped, repositioned laterally, then resumed advance at a different angle. Burke's predicted impact zone caught nothing but empty terrain. Tanis were learning. They'd realized American artillery had somehow improved, and they were adapting to neutralize that improvement. The cat-and-mouse game was entering a new phase. Burke started developing second-order predictions, trying to anticipate not just where the enemy would move, but how they might adapt their movement to evade predictive fire. If Chinese forces typically advance north but recently started incorporating lateral movements, his predictions needed to account for that adaptation. It was exhausting mental work. Burke was essentially playing chess against Chinese commanders, trying to predict their tactical decisions while they tried to predict his predictions. The cognitive load during combat was immense. That's when Burke encountered the work of Dr. Philip Morrison, a physicist who'd been studying ballistic prediction problems for the Army's Operations Research Office. Morrison had written a technical paper in 1943 titled Temporal Targeting in Dynamic Combat Environments. The paper addressed exactly the problem Burke was facing: how to hit targets that were actively trying to avoid being hit. Morrison's solution was mathematical, involving calculus and probability theory that Burke barely understood. But buried in the academic language was a practical insight. Against intelligent adversaries, predictions should incorporate randomization. Don't always aim for the most likely future position. Sometimes aim for the second or third most likely position. Force the enemy to account for multiple possible impact zones, spreading their formations thinner and making them easier to hit regardless of which evasion pattern they chose. Burke started implementing this approach in early June, when calling fire missions against mobile targets. He'd sometimes intentionally aim for secondary prediction zones, places the enemy might move if they were trying to evade his primary prediction. He'd vary his patterns, sometimes leading by standard amounts, sometimes by excessive amounts, sometimes by minimal amounts. The randomization made his individual missions less accurate, but it made Chinese defensive adaptation less effective. Enemy commanders couldn't predict his predictions anymore because he deliberately made his own predictions less predictable. his overall hit rate dropped from 70% to about 55%, but that was still far better than the 12% baseline. More importantly, the psychological effect on Chinese forces was significant. They'd adapted their tactics to counter-predictive artillery, but now the predictions themselves had become unpredictable. Chinese infantry advancing toward American positions faced artillery that sometimes hit them early, sometimes hit them late, sometimes hit them exactly on time. The uncertainty forced them to disperse more widely, slow their advance, hesitate more often. Even missions that missed were degrading assault effectiveness. By July 1951, the Army's artillery effectiveness against mobile targets had transformed completely. Training programs at Fort Sill incorporated predictive fire techniques into basic forward observer courses. Field manuals were updated to include sections on temporal targeting. What had started as Burke's unauthorized experimentation had become official doctrine. The statistical improvement was dramatic. Division-level analysis showed artillery hit rates against moving targets had climbed from 12% in March to 43% by August. That increase represented thousands of enemy casualties that previous artillery would have missed. Hundreds of American positions that held instead of being overrun, and a fundamental shift in how Chinese forces could operate in proximity to American artillery support. The Chinese adaptation continued throughout the war. By 1952, Chinese assault doctrine had evolved to include elaborate deception measures. False movements designed to draw predictive fire onto empty terrain and rapid formation dispersal that limited artillery effectiveness even against accurate predictions. The arms race between prediction and counter-prediction never stopped. But American artillery never returned to the simple-minded approach of shooting at current positions. The genie was out of the bottle. Every forward observer understood that temporal displacement was the critical factor in targeting mobile forces. Training evolved to include more sophisticated prediction techniques. Weather effects on shell flight time, terrain effects on enemy movement rates, even psychological profiles of enemy commanders whose tactical preferences could be learned and exploited. The technique reached its pinnacle during the Vietnam War, where similar problems emerged against mobile Viet Cong forces. Forward air controllers used the same predictive principles Burke had developed, adapted for faster-moving threats and fast-responding weapon systems. Close air support missions were planned not around where the enemy was spotted, but where they would be when ordnance arrived. Modern artillery has automated much of this calculation. Fire control computers can track moving targets with radar, calculate their velocity and direction, predict future positions, and automatically adjust fire missions to account for temporal displacement. A system like the M109A7 Paladin can do in milliseconds what took Burke minutes of mental calculation. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. You must shoot where the target will be, not where the target is. That principle applies equally to artillery shells with 40-second flight times and hypervelocity projectiles with 4-second flight times. Physics doesn't care about technology. The bullet and the target occupy space-time, and if they don't occupy the same space at the same time, there's no impact. Lieutenant Thomas. Burke survived the Korean War and returned to Montana in 1953. He left the Army and became a high school mathematics teacher, spending 30 years teaching calculus and physics to teenagers who had no idea their teacher had revolutionized artillery doctrine. He died in 1988. His name appearing in no official histories. His contribution recorded only in obscure military documents about fire control procedures. But every artillery forward observer since 1951 has used techniques derived from Burke's work. Every manual on targeting mobile forces incorporates his insights. Every fire mission called against moving targets involves calculations that trace directly back to a Montana lieutenant who started measuring things nobody had thought to measure. The broader lesson took decades to be fully understood. Military effectiveness often hinges not on better equipment or more firepower, but on better thinking about how to employ existing capabilities. American artillery in Korea was the finest in the world in terms of accuracy and power. It was useless against mobile targets because nobody had seriously considered the temporal targeting problem. Burke didn't invent new weapons. He didn't requisition better ammunition. He just thought carefully about why current methods weren't working and developed a better method based on observation and mathematics. His innovation was conceptual, not technological, and it proved more valuable than any hardware improvement. Modern military innovation programs reference Burke's story as an example of effective field adaptation. The rapid prototyping of tactical solutions. The willingness to test unproven methods under combat conditions. The bottom-up development of doctrine that later became institutionalized. All of these became models for how military forces should encourage innovation. The fact that Burke acted without authorization is usually presented as an unfortunate necessity rather than the core of the story. But authorization structures exist to prevent mistakes, and they inevitably slow adaptation. Burke made a calculation that waiting for approval would cost more lives than testing his idea might risk. He was right, but he was also fortunate that his commanders recognized the value of his innovation rather than punishing his violation of procedure. The strategic impact extended beyond casualty figures. Effective artillery support against mobile targets meant American infantry could hold positions with smaller force concentrations. Chinese assault tactics that relied on rapid movement became less effective, forcing them to adapt in ways that reduced their own operational efficiency. The cumulative effect of improved artillery effectiveness contributed to the stalemate that eventually led to armistice negotiations. Quantifying exactly how many lives Burke's innovation saved is impossible, but the math is suggestive. If artillery effectiveness against mobile targets increased from 12% to 43%, and if artillery supported approximately 60% of defensive engagements, and if each defensive engagement involved an average of 2 companies, the cascading effects touched tens of thousands of soldiers over the course of the war. Burke himself never tried to take credit. When asked about his role years later, he'd shrug and say, "I just noticed we were missing and figured out why. It wasn't complicated." But it was complicated in all the ways that matter when trying to change established systems. Identifying the problem required careful observation. Developing the solution required mathematical analysis and understanding of both ballistics and enemy behavior. Testing the solution required courage to violate doctrine. And spreading the solution required teaching others to think differently about fundamentals they'd internalized through training. Burke did all of that, not seeking recognition or advancement, but because watching enemy forces walk through ineffective artillery, barrages while American positions fell, was unacceptable. The problem was solvable, so he solved it. The artillery crews who learned to shoot where enemies would be rather than where enemies were never knew the full story. They didn't know a lieutenant in Montana had developed the technique through unauthorized field testing. They just knew that suddenly their missions were hitting targets they'd been missing for months. That Chinese assault effectiveness had declined. That defensive positions they were supporting had better survival rates. That was enough. That was everything. Thomas Burke looked at artillery targeting, saw that everyone was shooting at the wrong point in spacetime, and figured out how to shoot at the right point instead. He proved that tactical problems don't always require technological solutions. Sometimes they just require someone willing to think differently about fundamentals everyone else takes for granted. The shells he called down on Korean hillsides are forgotten now. The specific battles are footnotes in military history. But the lesson remains. Preserved not in monuments, but in the doctrine that every artillery forward observer learns. Account for temporal displacement. Predict future positions. Shoot where the target will be. That principle, born from frustration on frozen Korean hills, changed artillery warfare permanently. It demonstrated that even the most sophisticated weapon systems fail if employed with incorrect assumptions about how to target them. Burke's innovation wasn't better guns or faster shells. to his better thinking about when and where to use the guns and shells already available. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from laboratories or planning committees. They come from one observer who refused to accept that missing targets was inevitable, who measured what needed measuring, who calculated what needed calculating, and who proved that thinking differently could save lives that traditional thinking was wasting. Thomas Burke didn't invent predictive targeting. He just refused to keep shooting at where enemies had been instead of where they were going. And that refusal transformed into technique and spread through military networks, changed how artillery functions in modern warfare. The frozen hills of Korea are quiet now, but the lesson Burke taught there still echoes through every fire mission called against mobile targets anywhere in the world.